You get it okay?
I got it. Thanks. Yeah. Hey, welcome everybody. So I tried to find the most ridiculous styling, fashion, BS picture I could get up there, and then I paired it with a really weird font. Thanks. So this is me. This is, my name is Mike Herchel. I have a dog and a daughter. I work for Lullabot. Lullabot is a fully distributed company. We're an agency that does design strategy, of course, a lot of development. We've done cool websites like the Grammys and a bunch of NBC stuff like Bravo and Sci-Fi and NBC.com and MSNBC.com, a bunch of cool stuff. Oh, I also got a new puppy not too long ago. That's it, thank you. That's all I got. So in the beginning, W3C created CSS, right? It's a cool picture. This is what it was like. And we saw that it was good. You had your colors, fonts. And sometimes it was just okay, because you screw up your fonts and you don't know what the hell you're doing. So we're, and then sometimes you have to do your positioning through tables and it was horrible. So I'm going to talk about some new things that you can be using right now, and that includes, the first thing I'm going to talk about is CSS Variables. I'm going to talk how that's different than SAS variables. So what you're probably doing right now, if you're doing front end, who here, first of all, does front end developer? Awesome. Who here is a back end developer? And who's here just hanging out? For the recording, the majority of the people are just hanging out. So if you're if you are doing SAS, you're doing variables right here. And what these variables do is they just output to the CSS your hex value or whatever you're doing. But then those values are fixed, right? So back in 2010, this lady, Nicole Sullivan, I think she worked for Yahoo at the time or something like that. She created this an idea to do CSS variables. And CSS variables are different because you can change them at runtime. And what's really cool is that finally got implemented starting in 2012 with Chrome and kind of ending with Internet Explorer Microsoft Edge in 2015. So it's been supported for a long while. And the way it works is that you can you create these variables and you can change them dynamically. So this is the simplest use case right here. Now the root right there, that colon root, that represents just the root element, which in a normal web page is just your HTML element. And your CSS, they're really not called CSS variables, it's CSS Custom Properties. So you're creating this property and you're defining it yourself, and just like any other CSS property, it will cascade down, right? That's the C in CSS, is cascading. And it will cascade down to any other element, which you can then override on your elements down on the DOM tree. So when you're looking at this, you're going to see these dashes right there, and that's just kind of the way it is. In order to do a CSS custom property, you have to put those dashes in there. The reasoning behind that is because there was discussion to use things like the $sign, like SAS uses and all that type of stuff, but then that would make this incompatible with SAS. So they wanted, this is fully compatible with SAS, so you can do things in SAS where you set your CSS variable to a SAS variable and stuff like that. So in order to use that, you have this function, this var function right here, and it's about as easy as it looks right there, right? So I'm setting my background to the color of badass. And so at this point, you can override that on hover. Instead of just overriding the background property, I can override the color property. So you can see that on hover right here, it's going to change the color, the background color, to red. Does that make sense, kind of? So instead of changing the background property, I'm changing the color property. And there's certain use cases where that's really cool to do. So you can also do similar things on like with inline styles. It's the same thing as like overriding it, right? The inline styles will take precedence. And you can also set defaults. So like, you know, if you're using like a complex web app and you might screw something up where you don't have your color custom property defined, you can set the background to default to this. And of course, this is, it will use the color custom property, but if that's not available for whatever reason, it'll default to the whatever that second parameter is right there. And if you really want, you can even have your defaults be another CSS variable, which like it kind of gets into like a little CSS variable inceptions, you know. So I had that like really crappy meme there with exhibit. Sorry. So you cannot currently do. Well, all right. No. I'm getting ahead of myself. So you can use CSS variables with @support syntax. So does anybody ever hear of @support? Does anybody know what that is? I have two people, so this is awesome. It's really, really cool. So what @supports is a native CSS. This is not like a Sass thing. And what it does is it checks to see if your browser actually can do what you're doing. So I can say like @supports, I don't know, display grid or something like that, right? And then within these brackets right here, it will only parse this if that returns true. So at this point, if you want to use @support CSS variables, you can, it will only run this code or parse this code if this evaluates true. So that's kind of a nice little syntax thing to do. This right here does not work. Remember, it's CSS Custom Properties. It's not CSS Variables. So you cannot currently use custom properties in media queries like you can with Sass. Like you can use Sass variables in media queries within Sass, but this does not work right here. And there's an issue in Chromium to get it working in Chromium, but even if they get that working, it's still going to be, you know, several years till all the browsers support it, if that happens. So yeah. So there's certain things that when you can use Sass variables. I mean not Sass variables, but CSS custom properties with keyframes. So for like when you're doing the @keyframes, that's CSS animation, and so like what @keyframes is, you have your CSS selector, and then you set it to an animate, and you set your animation name, and then it'll pick this up right here, and then it'll just kind of animate it back and forth, depending on whatever you have right there. So you can animate two CSS variables, but you cannot animate the variables themselves. And that's a little weird. In my opinion, kind of effed up, because it would be really nice to be able to do that. But it's a little gotcha. You can do cool things right here. So what the heck am I doing right here? I think right here is what I'm doing is I'm using Sass variables. So I have my size set up right there. And I'm using the size in multiple places to keep the same aspect ratio. So this is an aspect ratio, doing like the 16:9, you know, the little TV movie size. And if I want to adjust this to make it bigger and smaller and stuff like that, I can just adjust this size CSS custom property, and then everything else will work. So what I'm doing right here is like I'm using this CSS calc function. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's been supported since Internet Explorer 9. You should be using it if you're not using it. And you can just do like basic math. You can do like addition, multiplication, and subtraction and stuff like that directly within your CSS. And you can add different units together. So like I could add, you know, like a rem with a percentage, you know, minus a VW unit or something like that. And you can do all of this, and your browser does it, and it works really well. Everybody kind of with me, ish? Ish, yeah. Does anybody have questions at this point?
No, we're already confused. It's good.
I can completely slow down. You have a question?
So is the CSS like storing local variables in the browser at runtime to keep this information in there?
Yeah, it stores everything. It gets parsed at runtime. So if you change stuff, it will like if you change stuff dynamically, everything will update dynamically. And I'll show you an example of that in a second too. Actually, I'm going to show you an example of it now. So I have my personal blog right here, and I did some cool stuff right here just to screw around. So this is built off of a static site generator called Gatsby, and I have like this cool stuff where if I click and I drag, and I move all it around, it's changing some CSS custom properties. And if I wrote like a cool blog about it, and if you look at, like you watch this color of the links right here, you can see that the link colors kind of change and that's all happening that's all happening dynamically and stuff like that. So, and I can talk about that at some point, but I only got like 45 minutes. So, yeah. So basically, the variables can be changed dynamically, however you want. You can change it in an inline style. You can update the head tag. You can do whatever you want. Everything cascades down like a normal CSS property.
So how's it scoped? Is it, as you said, is it like top down or is it?
Yeah, it's top down. It's like a normal CSS property. So like for example, like if you set your HTML to background red, everything's going to be background red until you override something, and the same thing, like, and then you can override it by setting like your body to background green. That will of course take precedence, and then you might have like a block or a component to say background turquoise or something like that. And then of course you can use your import in declarations and then anything else. It's like a CSS property, but it's custom.
That's why it's not a very.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not a static.
So I'm going to talk about Grid right now. So let me tell you how I learned about Grid, and I recommend everybody do this. Like I wrote an article about it. So CSS Grid is one of those things. Like I'm hearing people writing about it and like, oh, I'll learn that at some point. And then I see, like, I'm working on the Lullabot homepage. The new version of the Lullabot homepage is using CSS Grid, and I'm seeing the syntax. Oh, it doesn't look that complicated. I don't know what that's doing, but I'm just going to fudge around with it and get it working, And then I was like, I need to learn this. So I wrote an article. And this article is how I learned it, because the best way to learn is to teach. And like as I'm going through all of these like video tutorials and stuff like that on CSS Grid, I start writing and making notes. And then I realize, well, I don't know how this works. And then you start screwing around with that. And then I don't know how this works. And you start screwing around with that. And so I just took notes and I turned it into an article. And I'll show you that article afterwards, but it's a good way to learn. So in the beginning, this is how we did layout, right? We had a big old table. So this is like an allusion to table-based layouts if you did web development in the 2000s. So you had your TR-CDs, your spacer GIFs, and a bunch of shit like that. It was fun. And then if you got complicated, you did like this stuff, where you nest tables in your tables, and you're like, now I'm getting cool. I did all that. And then you did like float-based positioning, and this is really cool because I actually still have Dreamweaver installed on my computer.
I'm sorry.
I do it because if you're doing email templating, you need you're still using like tables, and like honestly, the only email templating I do is for Flutter Drupalcamp because I'm one of the people who spams people. I guess I had some salty thoughts at the time with those selectors. So at that point, you're doing floats, and so you have this proliferation of grid systems, right? So you have all these things like SUSE, Singularity, Bootstrap, 960 I think was one of the first Zen grids. I just Googled it. I never even used it or heard of it, but that's probably one now. And so you have all these grid systems that are working around like all the complicated float stuff. So you can do stuff like, I want this to span 2 columns. I want 12 columns wide, and I want it to span 2 columns. And then like what happened is you end up with like shitty markup like this, where it's like, you're like, what the heck's going on here? Why is it doing that? I hate that. you know, and I want it to be nice, and I know I'm the only one who looks at that, but still, you know. And and you end up with articles like this by like, so you can get exclusive marketing tips by like from deals, and you find the 13 best responsive CSS grid systems. Like, why is there 13 of these? Like, why is it so damn complicated? I don't want to like have to choose one. I don't have to learn them, and it's like it's so much bullshit. I just don't want to deal with that, you know. It's like I just want to have it working. And so you have CSS Grid, right? So CSS Grid is like the end-all be-all to this, and it's making awesome stuff. And so this is the what is it, meat and potatoes. I had this joke where I was gonna say, let's get into the meat and potatoes, and I was gonna show this. Yeah, I know. I'm bad at this. I'm like so bad at this. Yeah, so this is so this is the markup, right? You have your grid, container, and then you just have a bunch of items underneath of it. And it's like, that's easy. That's as easy as the markup gets. And so we're gonna talk about the parent syntax. So when I say parent syntax, I'm talking about parents, which is this container element, and then the children are of course the grid items, right? So let's go back. So to initialize the CSS grid, it's this simple: display grid. Of course, like you do that by default, and it like does nothing because you have to like set some parameters, or you have to tell it what to do. So you do display grid, and of course you can do @supports display grid, and only have and then that will, only the code in the brackets will apply. And so at this point you set up columns. So there's this property called grid template columns, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. What this does is this sets you have your parent item, and it has 3 200 pixels. This is like dead simple right here. Like you're gonna have 3 200 pixels. I don't know how better to describe it. Columns, and as your child elements will start going in there and going around. That's how it works. Your rows is very similar. Grid template rows. Auto. So by default, it's going to create 3 rows right here. You can just have autos like one time, and basically it'll create new rows as it goes through. But this will start with 3 rows. And it does exactly what you think it will do. You will have basically a grid with 3 columns, and as you add 4, 5, 6, 7 items in there, it will start wrapping and making those nice into a grid. You're going to see a lot of this right here, where instead of grid template rows and grid template columns, you just say grid template, and then you have your rows up here, and then you have your columns right there. So that's just a syntax change, same thing. And then you have repeat syntax. So repeat syntax is pretty neat because you, instead of like saying 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, I want 3 200 pixels, right? Kind of makes sense. And you can also like say if I want like the first column to be 300 pixels and then I want 3 200 pixels, you can do stuff like that. Does it kind of make sense-ish? Does anybody like completely lost or have questions at this point? Go ahead.
This works with any unit, right? So you can use
yes.
DW or VH?
Absolutely, yes. And you can mix and match them. You can use calc in here. You're going to see some stuff, and it's fantastically powerful.
What happens with mobile?
It works in mobile. I mean, like obviously, if you have like 3 columns and a 600, it's going to overflow, but that's what's expected. And there's ways that I'm going to detail where, like, of course, you can use media queries and change around your grid template columns. And there's other ways to do similar things that I'll talk about. Go ahead, Donna.
Why would you use pixels instead of like percentages or something?
Design, or you're lazy, or whatever.
I do percentages. It
works. Use, I think, like, I mean, that's a whole another thing. So like you're gonna see, like what I've showed you right there is like pretty basic CSS Grid, and CSS Grid is like, it's kind of like CSS in general. It's easy to get started, but it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. It gets complicated that deep in there. We're going to look at it. So another thing is grid gap. So grid gap is pretty much what you think it does. It puts gaps between the grids. You know, so like normally if you're floating stuff, you have your margin or your padding or whatever you're doing. This does grid gap, you know? And so you can see I'm using some VW units, some percent units. You can do grid row gap and grid column gap. They do what you think it does. And if you do grid gap like this, it does, I guess, columns, then rows. And you can use different units in there, like as I'm doing, and it kind of just works.
So grid gap with 24 is just shorthand for, you know, row gap and column gap.
Exactly, yes.
If I have two 200 pixel columns and I put in a grid gap of 20, is your grid end up being 420 or 400?
It's still like it's still. So you said 200 pixels?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Put in the grid gap.
Yeah, it's still. Shit.
It's like style.
Is it 420? Yeah, it is 420. Yeah, listen to Eric. 420. Yeah.
It doesn't subtract like
Yeah.
the grid.
Yeah. But you can use. Go ahead.
Can you use box sizing to fix that?
No, because it's not padding. Box sizing works on like padding and margins and stuff like that. But there's different ways to do that. Go ahead.
What I've seen is that they've essentially taken the foundations of all 13 of those systems, grid systems, and try to incorporate core.
Yeah. There's a lot of similar syntax stuff.
So, but in those systems, like for grid gap, for example, I guess is the equivalent of what a gutter would be in those systems. But gutters only appear between columns. Does this grid gap add gaps to the beginning and end columns?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, and it does not. It's just in between. It's just the gutters. And there's ways where, like, if your parent container is wider and your columns are narrower, you can justify them and stuff like that. And I'll talk about that in a bit too.
I think the spec is written so that the gap is actually a suffix to each column except for the last.
That makes sense. I trust you on that. I don't know that, but I believe you. MinMax is pretty cool because MidMax. So this is a function right here, and what it will do is it will allow the column to go from 100 pixels to 200 pixels, depending on like the width of the browser and the width of the content.
And it's fluid.
Yeah. And so it'll go in between there. So you get your minimum and your maximum, right? So what I'm doing right here is I have 200 pixel fixed column that's always going to be 200 pixels no matter what. And then I have 3 columns that go in between 100 and 200 pixels. And that will depend on the width of the browser and the width of the content. The FR unit, our FR units are new to Grid, and it stands for fraction, right? So what I'm doing right here is I'm creating 3 1FR units. So what that does is that's almost the same as doing like 3 33.3333% columns. And so if I do 3 2 fraction units, it's going to be the exact same thing because fractions are, equal. So in this case right here, you can see I have 2 fraction units, and then I have 2 columns, each with 1 fraction unit. So what this will happen? So you have a total right here of 4 fraction units, right? 1, 2, and then there's 2 of these, 3, 4. So this will end up taking 50% of the width of the grid, and then each of these columns will each take up 25%. Does that kind of make sense? Good. Autofill. So autofill and there's autofit.
Yeah.
And they're confusing.
Yep.
So autofill will automatically fill. Gosh, let me look at my notes.
Populate columns.
Yeah, I have my notes in here. I want to make sure I do this right. Autofill automatically adds the columns to the grid layout according to the width, right? Yeah. So that's I get these a little screwed up. So basically, if I have a grid container that's say like 1,000 pixels wide or something like that, and I have repeat autofill at 200 right here, you're going to have 5 columns in there. Does that make sense?
So this would be like to do something you'd see with a card grid, for instance,
Yeah.
where it overflows depending on how wide you get.
So you can see, like, with this autofill thing, you can set, like, say, the width to 100% or 100 VW or something like that, and you can make the whole thing responsive without using media queries. I know! Pretty cool, right? And then, even more, MidMax within the autofills right here, right? So MidMax within the autofills are really cool. So what this will do is this will autofill a MidMax between 200 and 1 FR. And at that point, like, all right, so like imagine if you don't know what grid is and you're looking at this syntax and you're like, WTF is this shit, you know? And so let me explain this to you because this is really awesome. So like what's going to happen is, say you set your width to like, you know, it's fluid, it's going to automatically fill in between 200 and 1 FR. And what that means is you're not going to have a case like as you make your grid wider, you're not going to have a case with a gap to the right. It will automatically, like it'll go out, and as it expands, it's always going to take up the full width of the grid. And as it gets smaller, it's not going to ever get smaller than 200, so it'll start wrapping. And you can do a lot of really cool responsive web design things using syntax similar to this. Auto rows and auto columns are basically, all right, let me read my, sorry about this. Specify the track size of the, yeah, so as your columns going up and down, those are called tracks, right? And so as you can set those to default right there, like say like the row by default, like the rows will be fit to the content, and I believe it's the auto rows will set them all to 30 pixels. So masonry. Does anybody know like the JavaScript masonry layout is and all that type of stuff? It's like when stuff like looks like it's all in the grid. Like say like you have like what do you call it? Boxes, and they're all different sizes, but they all like magically fit together and kind of look all cool. They look like bricks and stuff like that. Yeah, well, not Pinterest is more like of a card, but it's kind of like that, you know. But because all Pinterest cards are like the same width and they're in columns. But like, say if you have something that's like I don't know, like really large, and then you have some small ones, and then you have some small ones down here, and some medium ones. If you start either floating those or using like default grid and stuff like that, you're going to have gaps in there. You're going to have like these little gaps that show up, and you can see the background color and stuff, and it looks ugly. If you use this grid autoflow dense, it will take everything out of source order and use an algorithm and just fit stuff in there. And it's really cool because you're not using JavaScript. And it just kind of works. So let's look at the grid child, right? So all of that I showed you right there was on that parent item right there, right? But you have your grid children right here too. So you can align the tracks right here. So in this case, we have the grid parent is 1,000 pixels, and we have 3 300 pixel columns. So at this point, you have 100 pixels left over, right? Does that 100 pixels go on the left? Does it go on the right? Does it go in the middle? And use justify content in here. You'll recognize justify content from Flexbox, but the values are a little bit different. So you're not using like flex end, you're using end. And the same thing with line items right here. So line items goes vertical, justify content goes this way. So say I have a particular grid item and I want this to always, I want this grid item to start on the second column for whatever reason. And this is it right here, grid column start 2. That's pretty straightforward, and it's pretty awesome. And so by default, let's say this is this particular grid child is the first one listed there, you're going to have a gap to the left unless you use that like autoflow dense thing. But I'm going to kind of show some cool stuff here. So you can use the span keyword right here. And so I can do grid column start 1, and I want it to span 2. So that means it's going to span 2 columns. And it's also going to span the gap, and it's going to span those 2 columns, take up the full 2 columns. So at this point, I'm starting 2, I'm spanning 2. I'm starting on 2, and I can do the same exact thing by doing grid column and 4, right? So depending on your content, you might always want to end on the 4th column and start on the 2, or depending on your content, you might want to start on 2 and always take up 2. But by default, those 2 syntaxes are gonna do the same thing.
How does that work when your columns reflow to be a single column for mobile or less?
It'll overflow. Well,
Even if it is spanning 2?
I would assume so. Honestly, it's the type of thing I'd have to get in CodePen and screw around with. I would assume it would do it. Yeah. Same thing with rows. I want this to span multiple rows. It's it's kind of the same thing. So you can do, and you can see I have syntax right here where I'm doing. I'm specifying the grid column. This is the start and this is the end. So I'm going from grid column to start on column 2 and then column 4. Start on column 2 but span 2. Kind of makes sense? Ish? I'm trying to see how much time I have left here. 15? I had 10. No. Alright. Same thing with rows. Alright. Went over that. It can span multiple rows in basically the same syntax, but you're using row instead of column. So this is pretty neat right here. You can, this is the same as column. So you know how we did grid column 2? You can do grid row 2. And I'm going to show you some little tweaks with this that's pretty neat too. So you see how I'm using this negative number right here? So you know when I'm specifying grid column, I can do grid column 1, grid column 2, grid column 3, stuff like that. But what if I don't know how many columns are there, but I always want it to take up the second from the end, right? That could be a use case. You specify negative numbers. So negative 1 is always the last column there. Negative 2 is always the second to last column, and stuff like that. So what you can do is you can have it specify, so say if I have a grid with an unknown number of columns, and I want this thing to always take up the full width, because it's maybe an advertising banner or something like that. So I can say grid column start, 1, grid column end, 1, negative 1. So it always starts on the first column, always ends on the last column. And then I can hard code that in grid row 3, and this is just the shorthand syntax right here. And so basically what this element is going to do, it's always going to be on row 3, and it's always going to take up the full width. So that could be useful for teasers, advertising, stuff like that. I've done stuff like this before, and it's kind of complicated when you're integrating in media queries, JavaScript, and all this together. And this makes it a lot easier, and it's a lot more performant because it's just CSS. Everybody kind of understand what's going on there? See a lot of nodding heads and some people staring vacantly off at the ceiling. So right here, you can see the shorthand syntax. I'm starting on column 2, and it's spanning. And then I have a little slash, and then it's going to span 2. You've seen that before a little bit? Helpful syntax.
Do you have to have spaces around the slash?
I honestly don't know. I would assume so.
I think so, because otherwise it's
Yeah,
easier.
I would assume so, but yeah. So my experience doing this in production is doing some of the stuff on Lullabout's homepage, and right now, like for our clients, we're still supporting Internet Explorer 11, so I'm not using this on like any, larger sites. Any question?
Yeah, I was going through that grid garden thing you gave us yesterday, and it did need spaces.
Oh, there you go. I would definitely cross-browser test that. Helpful syntax. So, all right. So everything I showed you right there this is like it's web development. So there's like 16 ways to do like everything. So I'm going to show you some different ways, and you're going to see some more syntax, some more WTF syntax in here. That's pretty cool. So you can do what's called named lines. So you see these brackets right here? So what these are is, like, imagine you have your grid, and then there's lines. You draw those lines in there, and those are the lines right here. So I can, right now, I'm going to set, I use my grid template columns, which is the same property as I did before. But I have these brackets in here, and so I'm creating a line on the left, and a line at the very end. And I'm going to show you why that's kind of cool. So at this point, I have my media query, and I set the parent grid item to, I set my content start after, not at the very beginning, but after the first column. And then I have my content end still like at the very end, right? So you can see like right here, the content start is after the first column, and right here, the content starts all the way on the left. And then on my grid child, I just do grid column content start. And so what this does is this is the same as this right here. So this is like where you start getting like complicated crap going on. So this is the same as this. So this will start wherever it sees this. So like you have your content start line over here, and then you'll have your content. You'll have that grid child element right there. And so what's kind of cool about this is you're moving around the position of this, but you don't have any media queries under here. Does that make sense? So you define your grid, like, so say like I am a, I don't know, I'm the front-end developer, well, I'm a pretend front-end developer, and I'm creating like a grid system. I can do all these grid, content start, content ends, have my media queries all set up. And all that, like say if I have a designer in there doing CSS, or like a content editor who does light CSS, all they know how to do is like, this goes into content. This starts into content, and they just type that, and then it's already mobile. They don't have to screw around with media queries and all that other crap. Make sense-ish? And there's like no one nodding. I'm going to go over this one more time. You have a question? You're like, all right. Yeah. So, man, I wish I had like, if only I had an illustration.
So essentially, you can predefine columns around using just CSS.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about where the content is going to fall. The content will always be the same place in Markup.
Yeah.
In CSS, you can move it back and forth.
Yeah, that makes sense without media queries, right? So that's
in your example here, content start and content end have context in their naming. But it could very easily be first column, second column, third column, fourth column.
You could just call this, yeah, exactly. So, content start over here is on the left, very left of the grid. Content start right here has a column to the left of it, so it's kind of in the middle of the grid. And on this grid child, it's going to follow wherever that content start is. That makes sense. All right. It's not easy to, like, this is, as I said earlier, it starts off kind of easy, and then it gets more complicated as you go down. And to tell you the truth, the best way to learn it is just to start doing it. And then if you can teach someone about it. If you teach someone about it, then of course you're going to learn even better. It gets more complicated though.
So you can create like a side menu sort of thing with this, where you have your grid child, have the content start, and you have your menu start over on the left-hand side with the 1FR. So it's 75%, 25% here, and then as soon as it gets to mobile, as soon as it gets to mobile.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So you're doing all your media query stuff on the grid container as opposed to like on your children's stuff that you normally have to do.
As media queries should be used for layout.
Yeah, exactly. It gets more complicated. named areas. And they even get, yeah. So named areas are kind of cool because you literally see a grid in what you're doing here, right? So so now I'm not doing lines, right? I'm doing areas. So like the area is like the place where the grid child would go, if that makes sense, right? So I've named areas. So basically at mobile, I'm just doing my header, content, sidebar, footer, right? And in the maybe tablet size, you can see I'm kind of doing header, header, which means the header is going to span both. Sidebar on the left, content, and then footer, footer. You can imagine that. And this is valid. This completely works. Isn't it? It's pretty cool. It gets more complicated. So it does all that. And you can see right down here, I have a dot. The dot is an empty space. So like what you're going to see down here at the desktop width, I have a sidebar spanning multiple rows, but not going into the footer row. And then I have a header going multiple columns in one row, content, and then my footer leaves a blank area over here and then spans over there. Kind of makes sense? It's pretty cool, right? It is. Yeah.
And just to note, I mean, you kind of pretty printed it there where it's visually in columns. It really just only needs to be separated by a single space.
Yeah, so, and what you're going to see is like, so like, you type this, and of course, like your CSS typically will get, minified and stuff like that, where it strips out all the line breaks and all this type of stuff, and it puts a space in there. So you're going to see this on one line. And when you look in developer tools, like you're looking at Chrome developer tools or Firefox dev tools, it shows up in one line. I created issues with both of those browsers that they should show it like this.
Well, but it's still separate strings for each row.
Yeah.
So it's just a string in quotes separated by space.
And you can like obviously like you can see like I have a bunch of space over here and stuff. Like this is how I would write it. But you can imagine like this can all get concatenated to one line, and then you're like, what the hell is this?
Are those predefined names, or you can use make new stuff?
You can call it anything you want. So I can call it, Mike, Joe, Eric, Todd,
Okay.
whoever.
Well, you define them up at the top.
Yeah. So and then you say grid area. So you can see up there. That's where I'm assigning where everything goes. So like you can see where header will correspond to this right there. Right? Does that kind of make sense? Grid template shorthand. Man, didn't I talk about this already?
A little bit, yeah.
Rows and columns.
Yeah, I don't know why that slide's there. Maybe just recap. Oh, so this is awesome. So then you're looking at stuff like this, and you're like, what the hell is this going on right here? So so you can see over here I have my columns, but then I'm doing rows and then columns over here. So, and this is, you can kind of see how we do it. So the rows are 200 pixels. The columns are 300 pixel, and then like 3 1FR unit, equal units. And so if you're getting fancy and complicated, you can write stuff like this. My personal opinion is like maybe in like 5 years start writing stuff like this when people know how CSS Grid works and are familiar with it. But like as a developer, you have to write understandable code sometimes too, and sometimes you have to kind of write code that if you have a junior developer, they can get in and work with it. So I typically would split that out, but you might see this in the wild someday, and just know that it exists, and that's how it works. Does everybody understand that kind of?
The columns, the repeated columns, how large would those actually be, like in this particular case?
It depends on the width of this. So like, let's say like if I have like width 1,000 pixels, right? So I have 300 pixels right here. So I have 700 pixels left. And so 700 divided by 3 is what, like 633, or no? Some value, and they're going to be equal. Oh man. So yeah, CSS Grid is supported, right? It's not supported by Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer 11 actually supports like an earlier version of CSS Grid. Internet Explorer 11 supports like some a slightly different syntax and does different things than your modern browsers, which can completely screw you over. So I would say if you're supporting, like I'm making a decision right now on my current client project, we have support Internet Explorer 11, and it's a very tight timeline, and I'm saying let's not screw around with support making grid work on I11. Let's just do it using Flexbox and floats or whatever, and probably use tables.
Which browsers have specific dev tools that illustrate the grid? Is it just Firefox?
Oh, no, Chrome doesn't have to.
It does?
We can show this. How much time do I got left?
You're out of time.
Oh, shit. Hold on. So that's where we're at. Thanks. Oh, so I was going to talk about a bunch of stuff, but whatever. So I Googled thank you and then just took a screenshot. Yeah, it's good.